Uh, we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 11. And if you want to go there, you can. If not, we don't have time to go into this. We've all heard many lessons on this, but I think it's important. This is not in your commentary. I think it's important to bring up how the Hebrew writer looks at all this stuff. And this is final part of this review. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And by the elders it was obtained good report. And notice how the writer goes on. Abel offered unto God. Enoch was translated. He walked with God and God took him. By faith, Noah, being warned of things not seen. It's been conjectured that Noah built a boat maybe 500 miles away from any water, if there was, and packed a bunch of animals in there. And I listened to some guy say, you know what they called Noah? Crazy. He was nuts. But Noah did these things, the Hebrew writer says. And now it says, by faith, when he was called to go out of the place where he should, after receive his inheritance, obeyed and went out not knowing whither he went, by faith he sojourned into a land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles, tents, with Isaac, Jacob, and the heirs with him in the same promise, for he looked for a city without foundation, which the maker is of God. And I was listening and reading something, preparing for this lesson, and the commentator said, faith is that electric that connects us with the reality of God. You know, to this day, scientists can't explain light. They don't understand it. But if we read the Bible, God tells us what light is. Scientists can't explain to us what happens to us after death, but God tells us. Scientists can't explain how we really got here, but God does. So it's that kind of faith. And notice the word there that the writer begins with, things hoped for. We have a hope. So we get down towards the end of Genesis chapter 15. Abram is in Egypt, and he's with Pharaoh. Why did Pharaoh put all these material blessings, you might say, onto Abram and his family?
Because he gave him his wife. He traded his wife for good figure.
Pharaoh was hoping to put her in part of his harem, right? And part of that was he would endow with him, since Abram was saying that this is my sister, he was giving him all these endowments, cattle, maidservants, and men servants, donkeys, camels, so that he could make a trade here. That's what was going on. So we see that Abram is richly blessed from this. Maidservants. Remember that word, maidservants. Is that going to be a curse? Anybody know who I'm talking about? Hagar. Was it a blessing or a curse? Hagar is going to come up. Good morning. Got some visitors here. Good, nice to have you here. We're in Genesis chapter 13, building up to that. We've got extra books up here if you need a welcome. We're still reviewing, but Pharaoh gives Abram, we might say, some baggage. It's going to come up to haunt him, especially Hagar. So Pharaoh finds out through all these plagues. I'll review again. He said, why did you do this? As Michael said, he might not have conducted himself very well. And so Pharaoh kicks him out. And I ask the question here, did Abram lose faith temporarily? Why did Abram, we looked at this last week, lie, basically? I know he was looking out for his own life. Did he trust God? Did he trust God when he left the land where there was famine? Uh-oh, I got a thing.
Well, you asked why Abram lost faith. He did that because he thought maybe that he might get killed if they found out that
Right.
she was his wife.
Right.
They might kill him.
But did he trust God instead? He figured that God would take care of that? So a returning Abram and his family possibly becomes sanctified, coming back out of the land of the corruption of idol worship, as Michael pointed out last week. And I got a thing messed up here, but this area he moves into is called the South. He went up out of Egypt. Now we're in our today's lesson, chapter 13, verse 1. He came out of Egypt with his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him. He went into the south of this Negev area. And that term there, again, I got it covered up. I'm sorry. I looked at all these. I don't know how that happened. It's called, this word is called the unused root. To the south, the drought. This is a dry, parched land still. So here we got a map of where he went out of Egypt and went into this Negev. I don't know how to say the word exactly, but south of Bethel. They move into this area. You can see the Dead Sea there, the Jordan River. This is the area he moves back out of when he's told to get out of here. So we see what's coming up. Some of this curse, I think, some of this problem with this decision making comes up. This is not the first time we're going to see this. He had already been blessed in chapter 12 with maid servants, men servants. This is before he went down there. And he starts, with all this wealth, he starts having trouble. Genesis chapter 13, we see this problem setting up. They can't support themselves. Apparently, the famine was over. They're still having trouble. They accumulated Lot and Haran. Abram accumulated some wealth in Haran. We don't know how much of. And he accumulated more wealth again in Egypt. And maid servants. Anybody here think they've accumulated enough wealth yet in their life? Anybody would like to have a little bit more? Or are we satisfied that God will take care of us? That God knows just what's right for me? How many times have we seen these stories where they've won the lottery and then a year later they're broke, destitute, and succumb to alcohol? They thought they needed that. And of course, I think the application for us is that God knows what we need, doesn't he? Chapter 13, verse 2. So Abram was very rich in cattle, silver, gold. The princes of Pharaoh saw his wife, commended her for her beauty, and Pharaoh was trying to bring her to her house. We see all these things setting up. Abram probably thought it was a good thing. Certainly he was fearing for his life. Maybe he was out for material gain. Aren't these all things that we succumb to? Sometimes lose faith in God's ability to take care of us. We think we know what's best for us. And so we see this set up again, where they came up from the south to Bethel. They pitched their tents between Bethel and Ai. The New King James says it's H-A-I. I've seen it different ways placed here. But they're in this area of Canaan again. They come back to the promised land that God has promised them. They left. We're not sure exactly why. Maybe God told them. Maybe God said, use your own ability to think here. He went to Egypt during the drought, but they're back. They've accumulated a lot of wealth, and now there's strife among the families. It's not the first time they've been here. Remember, back in Genesis chapter 12, they pitched their tents to Bethel. Bethel means habitation of God. Beth actually means, we're going to look at this in a second, I'm getting ahead of my slide here, but actually means a place to set up. We call that a house. El is always a word for God in the Hebrew. And here it says H-A-I on the east. And again, it's 13 verse 4, what's Abram do? What's he set up, Gene? Sets up another altar. So there's this theme again. Abram comes back out of Egypt. We don't know exactly what he was thinking, but he thanks God that he's here, I think. Another area here, Bethel, Ai. This territory, I'm going to show you in a minute, comes up again and again in the Old Testament. Bethel to Jericho. Jericho, Jordan, all these areas here become very important in our Old Testament Bible studies. Some of the old names, Bethel and Ai and Mizpah, there's questions about Gibeon, where some of these places are. That's why there's question marks there. They called the name of the place Bethel, the name that was called Luz at first. And in Genesis 31:13, God says, I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, and where thou vowest a vow to me. This is later on. In chapter 35, God tells Jacob, arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there and make another altar to the God. I have that word. Let us arise to go up to Bethel, Jacob says. Make an altar. So Jacob in 35:36 came to Luz, remember, which is also another name for Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan. That is Bethel, and all his people were with him. Very, very seat. And Jared brought up a point last week that this sets up the whole idea of our faith in God in these chapters. Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died. She buried her in Bethel under an oak tree. Picture of the Jordan River. Jacob called the name of the place where he spoke with God Bethel. They journeyed to Bethel. Rachel traveled there to see her hard labor. 1 Kings, they offered up an Abel. And this is important here. 1 Kings chapter 12:33. We looked at this a few years ago. Jacob actually, I'm getting ahead of my skis here. Jeroboam actually sets up a place of worship here, which was not at the time sanctified by God. There's 59 verses in the Old Testament list the word Bethel, but the New Testament is silent. And then Joshua sends men to Jericho and Ai, and there's a battle here. Bethel, a place of dwelling. El means God, strength, an adjective, mighty. All these terms are synonymous with Bethel. So it becomes a very important city in the Old Testament. Commentary says in your book, we're not sure why Abram built an altar here or another altar, but his Michael mentioned a couple weeks ago, there was a lot of idol worship going on. He might have been giving thanks that he made it back to the promised land. All these areas, all these ideas come up.
It's gonna be north of Jerusalem when David's king. I mean, so it's kind of in the center of what will eventually become the kingdom of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So it's near Jericho and all that stuff. So
Yep.
apparently that was in God's plan when he moved his people out of Egypt back to the land that he was going to use.
Part of God, it was definitely part of God's plan. It's a significant area. In Genesis 26:18, we see Isaac digs up a well again of water. And in Genesis chapter 13:6, we see the land was not able to bear him. And one of the big issues was water. And we find out later on that Abram built wells here, dug wells. We say Jacob, Isaac in chapter 26 redigs these wells. He runs into the same problem. What interestingly enough though is the inhabitants of this land don't bother Abram. But later on we see here in Genesis 26 that the Philistines stopped them after the death of Abraham. So a lot of scripture in this area. Genesis 13:7, there was strife between the herdmen, and Abram intercedes. Page 110 in your commentary talks about it's truly a shame when the worldly individuals get along with one another better than those who profess to follow Christ. And the commentary says that on your page 110 here is that the area there, the inhabitants that were there before Abram, we're going to mention them in a minute, didn't seem to have a big problem with Abram coming into the area. Of course, they were sort of in the confines of the city, but the children of God were sort of having fights among themselves. Genesis chapter 13:8, Abram says, "Let there be no strife, I pray thee.